This is a Unit 2 review. The skeletal system. Okay, we're going to talk about the skeletal system now, and some of the functions would be support, also protection. As we know, the skull protects the brain and some of the organs of special senses. The ribs would protect the lungs, the sternum would protect the heart, and then you've got the pelvic cavity, and the spinal column itself would protect the spinal cord. Movement, we know that muscles do the moving, but the bones actually provide leverage to make those muscles a lot more effective in their movements. Storage, the bones are one of the main storehouses for calcium. Also in adults, this is where blood cell production takes place. We're going to find blood cell production in the spongy bone, usually in the epiphyses of those bones. So let's take a look at long bone structure. The shaft of the bone itself is going to be called the diaphysis. It's going to be made up of compact bone. It's very dense. And on the ends of the bones, we find the epiphyses. The epiphyses are going to be made up of spongy bone or cancellous bone. Another name is trabecular bone. And again, these are found on each end. We have a proximal epiphysis, which is closer to the body. We have a distal epiphysis, which is farther away. And then as the skeleton develops and grows, we have these things called epiphyseal plates. The epiphyseal plates, or what you probably know it as, is the growth plate. These are made of hyaline cartilage, and basically through, as the fetus is developing, it starts off, most of the long bones, as hyaline cartilage in a process called enchondral ossification, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And pretty much the growth plates are what's left over as the child is still growing. And again, we call them epiphyseal plates. And as the child eventually reaches adulthood and stops growing, these epiphyseal plates then become the epiphyseal lines. So let's take a look at an epiphyseal line. And you can see that these would show up in the X-ray as kind of a dense line. The epiphyseal plates on X-ray, however, would just show spaces because the X-rays would go right through it. The fact that there's no calcium there to absorb or deflect the X-ray, they wouldn't show up. The bones actually almost look fractured. But in the adult, we do have the epiphyseal lines. Also, in a long bone, we have the medullary cavity. And what we find in that medullary cavity is some red bone marrow, but mostly yellow marrow. It's yellow because it's made of fat. It's for energy storage. And covering the bone, on the outside of the bone, or the perimeter of the bone, we have the periosteum. Again, peri is the perimeter. So it's the outside covering of the bone. Again, there's a lot of nerve endings there. If you've been kicked in the shins or whacked your shin, you know it really hurts. That's because the periosteum is very close to the surface. And if it gets bumped or bruised or pulled or separated or broken, it's very painful. And the periosteum is held in place by what's called Sharpie's fibers. This is a pretty good name because they actually look very sharp and almost tack that periosteum to the bone. Now, we have other name now for Sharpie's fibers. They're called perforating fibers. And also, to go back to Sharpie's fibers for a second, that's also what is going to attach a tendon to bone. And then we have what's called the endosteum. The endosteum is what's going to line the medullary cavity and the different blood vessel canals that run through the bone. So endo means inside, so endosteum. Okay, looking at cells that are a big part of the skeletal system, we have osteoblasts. And if you remember, osteoblasts make bone. Walk up to an osteoblast, say, oh, what do you do for a living? He says, I make bone. You say, do you like your job? And he says, I have a blast making bone. Don't forget, blasts have a blast making things. So here's the osteoblast. And as the slide says, it's for the formation of bone through ossification or osteogenesis. So in other words, it makes bone. Osteocytes are mature osteoblasts. And they're going to live in a space called a lacuna. So osteocytes, and if we were looking at cartilage, chondrocytes also live in lacuna. And coming away from the lacuna, we're going to find caniculi. Caniculi means little canal. So these are tiny little fluid-filled canals that allow the osteocytes to communicate with one another. Osteoclasts, if you look at this picture, it kind of looks like that Scrubbing Bubbles commercial where it's like stripping away, all the scum and soap buildup on your shower wall or tub. Well, think about the osteoclasts like that as well. The osteoclasts they break down bone. Basically, they're going to secrete acid and some enzymes that actually begins to dissolve the bone. The bone that is being dissolved, that calcium being dissolved, is going to be reabsorbed back into the bloodstream, and it'll help raise blood calcium levels. So we see the osteoclasts are responsible for bone resorption. Again, this is where the bone gets kind of broken down or dissolved in a sense. An osteon. An osteon is a single unit of bone, and the osteon or Haversian system is composed of a central canal. That central canal is going to hold blood vessels. It's going to have concentric lamella, and these are the rings that go around. And actually, it's more than just a ring. That ring represents the material in between. It's, again, if you think about taking a piece of paper and putting it between two pieces of plastic, and usually you run it through a heater, what is that called? Laminating. So basically we have a sheet of bone that's laminated on top of another sheet of bone that's laminated on top of another sheet of bone. And when we look at it on end, it gives us this ring appearance, almost like a tree. You cut through a tree, you see those rings. That's the appearance that we get. And then also, it almost looks like there's little ants sitting along those rings. Those are going to be the osteocytes, again, sitting in a lacuna. Okay, and so if we look at that central canal, we also call it a Haversian canal, and that's going to run parallel to the long axis of the bone. So again, when we look at the bone on end, we see just a circle. If we were to slice the bone lengthwise, we would see more of a long channel. And then, again, the lamella are the concentric circumferential, hard word to say, circumferential rings within the bone. And then we have blood vessels that are going horizontally, and these are called perforating canals or Volkmann's canals. Volkmann's canals are the longer name. And again, they're going to go perpendicular to the long axis of the osteon. And basically that allows for collateral circulation between the central canals. So it helps to bring blood deeper into the bone. Okay, bone development. We have intramembranous ossification, takes place in connective tissue membrane. Again, to me, that kind of reminds me of doing paper mache, Maybe you blew up a balloon and that was your form, and then you took the paper mache and kind of laid it out on top of that form. And then after it dried, you might pop the balloon and pull it out. It's kind of the way intramembranous ossification is, where we have a connective tissue model, and the bone eventually replaces that connective tissue model. Enchondral ossification, just as it says, endochondral, enchondral ossification takes place in cartilage. So we start off with a hyaline cartilage model, and eventually that gets replaced by bone. And as an adult, all that's left is our articular cartilage, the cartilage that's on the ends of our long bones, making our joints. And so both of these methods of ossification produce what's called woven bone that's then remodeled, and after remodeling, you pretty much can't tell the difference between one or the other. Okay, so let's take a look at bone repair. If we were to break a bone, the first thing that would form is a hematoma. If you've ever pinched yourself with a pair of pliers or something and you get this little blood blister, that's a hematoma. So the blood is going to fill up, and as you can see in this picture, the blood has also lifted the periosteum and broken the periosteum. So this could hurt here. After that, we get a callus formation. The internal callus formation is going to be that of cartilage. Okay, so we get some cartilage. Woven bone is going to start to encroach on it, and basically we're going to form a callus. Okay, now the internal callus, again, is going to be made of cartilage. Eventually, well, also the external callus as well is made of cartilage. And then eventually that cartilage ossifies. And then we're going to start to remodel that that bone, that ossified cartilage. And again, it's the job of the osteoclasts to come in and help with remodeling. And after bone remodeling, it's many times hard to tell that there actually was any type of a fracture, provided that fracture was set properly. And again, everyone heals a bit different, so there might be, still a slight bump there. Sometimes you can still tell on X-ray, but most of the time, again, if the fracture is set appropriately, the bone will be remodeled almost like new again. Now let's talk calcium homeostasis. Bone is, again, the major storage site for calcium in the body. Calcium moves into the bone when osteoblasts build new bone. Remember, osteoblasts have a blast making things? Well, they got to get their material from somewhere. They're going to make bone. Their material, one of the main materials, is going to be calcium. And so they're going to pull that calcium from the blood, and that'll usually lower blood calcium levels, and they're going to use that as their building material. Now, calcium moves out of bone as osteoclasts break down the bone. Now, if you're pulling calcium out of the bone, it has to go somewhere, so that's going to go into the bloodstream and actually raise blood calcium levels. And then when osteoclast and osteoblast activity is balanced, the movement of calcium in and out is equal, and we maintain our skeleton. Now, if the osteoclasts are outworking the osteoblasts, what do you think we might wind up with? Okay, if you guessed osteoporosis, you would be correct. Or even osteopenia. Osteopenia is not as severe as osteoporosis. Osteopenia means thinning bones. And as we age, there's a normal amount of osteopenia that takes place. But osteoporosis, that's a bit more severe, and we can wind up with pathological fractures. Okay, the skeleton is made up of axial skeleton and appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton, as you can see here in turquoise, is made up of the skull, the vertebral column, and the sacrum, and the rib cage, and the sternum, and also the hyoid bone, which is not shown here. So, skull, hyoid bone, vertebral column. And again, the vertebral column includes the sacrum, and then the thoracic or rib cage, which includes the sternum. The appendicular skeleton, as you can see here, refers to the appendages. So that is going to include your limbs, your arms and your legs, and your girdles, which includes your shoulder girdle or pectoral girdle, and your pelvic girdle. And if you notice, the pelvic girdle is composed of the coxal bones. Okay, they are part of the appendicular skeleton. Joints. And as you can see here, this is a shoulder joint, or what we would call a glenohumeral joint, where the humerus sits in the glenoid cavity. And if you remember during class, I talked about the difference between a separated shoulder and a dislocated shoulder. A separated shoulder is going to take place right here at the clavicle and the acromion process. A dislocated shoulder is going to take place right here at the glenohumeral joint. So the proximal epiphysis here of the humerus would actually be pulled out of the socket, and that would constitute a shoulder dislocation. So the meaning of a joint is a joint or articulation is the site where two bones meet. And usually when we think of joints, the main joint that usually comes to mind are the freely movable joints. Now, the fact that these are freely movable joints, that means they're not going to be quite as stable as some of the other joints we've talked about. Okay, so they can be unstable. And if you have knee problems, you can probably vouch for that. So freely movable joints, we're going to call those diarthroses or synovial joints. So that would be like your fingers, shoulders, knees, ankles, things like that are freely movable. Structures within a synovial joint, we'll use the knee as an example. In the knee, we're going to find articular cartilage of each bone. So again, that's the hyaline cartilage found on the ends of the bones. We find a joint capsule that's made of dense irregular connective tissue. And lining that joint capsule, we're going to find a synovial membrane. And that synovial membrane secretes synovial fluid, which is a very slippery, slick fluid that helps prevent and reduce friction within the joint. And then we find these little sacs called bursa. Typically the sacs are flattened out, but if they become inflamed, they can fill up with fluid. And if you've ever had water on the knee, for instance, or nursemaid's knee it's called, that's an example of a bursa, usually the prepatellar bursa, since we're talking about the knee, that has become irritated, fills up with fluid, and kind of balloons out. And again, these are meant normally to help cushion the joint and protect it. And then we have our supporting ligaments. In the knee, we have a few extra ligaments. We've got the anterior and posterior cruciate ligaments. They help keep the knee from translating too far forward or too far back. And then we have our medial and lateral collateral ligaments, and those are found on each side, the lateral side and the medial side, connecting the two bones. And that's going to help prevent too much movement from side to side. Okay, types of movement. Well, types of movement of a freely movable joint and As you can see, one of the bullet points had already popped up. And so let's go ahead and talk about that. Inversion and eversion. Inversion, if you think about your foot, if you're going to look at your instep, so the medial portion of your foot, that is going to be inversion. And you can go ahead and look at the picture there too. So inversion is tilting your foot to kind of look at the instep. Eversion is tilting your foot outward like you're going to look at the edge of your foot. Flexion and extension. Flexion, we're going to decrease the angle of a joint. So think about flexing your biceps, flexing your arm. If we flex it, we're going to decrease the angle. If we extend it, we're going to increase the angle. So picture extending your arm out in front of you. That joint is your elbow joint is at 180 degrees. As you begin to flex your arm, it'll come up to maybe 90 degrees and then 45 degrees. Again, we're decreasing the angle, so that's flexion. Abduction and adduction. Again, I say abduction because abduction and adduction sound quite a bit the same. So, abduction, if somebody is abducted, what happens to them? They get taken away. So, abduction is away from the midline of the body, where adduction, we're going to add it toward the midline of the body. Okay? And again, refer to the picture. And we discussed inversion and eversion. Supination and pronation. Supination. Picture putting your hand out, palm up, to take a bowl of soup. So that's supination. Pronation, you're turning your hand over, exposing the back of your hand. Now it's prone to being smacked. So supination, palm up to take some soup. Pronation, your hand is, back of the hand is facing up, and it's prone to getting whacked. Circumduction is a kind of a rotation. Again, if you take a look at the picture, you'll see an example of circumduction. And what's not listed on here is dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. Dorsiflexion is pointing your toes up and, at the ankle. So you're bringing the ankle up. And plantar flexion is at the ankle, pointing your toes down.